The crash echoed through the hills, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were close, too close. Miss Tiny, Johnny, and Rasta John froze, their hearts pounding in the silence that followed. The air was thick with tension as the realization sank in. The men were back, and this time they weren't taking any chances. "Dem coming to kill me," Johnny whispered, his voice trembling. Miss Tiny's eyes narrowed. "Not if me can help it." Rasta John stepped forward, his expression dark and focused. "Dem not gwine wait dis time. We have to move now." Without hesitation, they slipped out the back of the hut, moving swiftly and quietly through the dense bush. The hills were treacherous at night, the steep terrain slick from the earlier rain. Miss Tiny's legs burned with every step, but she pushed on, determined to protect Sandra, and maybe, just maybe, save Johnny. "Where we gwine go?" Miss Tiny panted, glancing back at Rasta John, who led the way. "There's a spot deeper in the hills," he said, his voice low. "Old hideout me used to know. Safe, for now." Behind them, they could hear the men searching, their voices growing louder as they neared the hut. Miss Tiny's heart raced, but she couldn't afford to panic. They had to stay ahead. As they pushed further into the bush, the landscape opened into a small clearing where a dilapidated shed stood, half hidden by overgrown vines and trees. Rasta John motioned for them to hurry inside. Once inside, Miss Tiny, Johnny, and Rasta John crouched low, listening for any sign of their pursuers. The only sound was the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. For a moment, it seemed they had lost them. But then a new voice pierced the silence, a familiar voice that sent chills down Miss Tiny's spine. "Johnny," the voice called out, mocking and cruel. "You think you can run from we? We find you wherever you hide." Johnny's face went white with fear. "Dat voice," he stammered, backing up against the wall of the shed. "It's Leon." Miss Tiny's blood ran cold. Leon was one of the most notorious men in Kingston, known for his ruthless dealings and his complete lack of mercy. If he was here, things were worse than any of them had imagined. "Leon?" Miss Tiny whispered, glancing at Rasta John. Rasta John nodded grimly. "Leon no play games. If he's here, it's because he personally want Johnny dead." Miss Tiny felt a surge of anger. "And what about Sandra? She's still in danger?" Johnny nodded, his face pale. "If me no pay Leon, dem text Sandra next." Rasta John clenched his fists. "We can't make that happen. We need a plan." But before they could discuss further, the shed's door was kicked open with a loud crash. Leon stood there, flanked by two heavily armed men, a smirk playing on his lips. He took a step inside, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. "Well, well," Leon drawled, his eyes locking onto Johnny. "Me been looking for yuh. Me surprised yuh bring company." Miss Tiny stood up, defiant. "Leave Johnny. Yuh nah need to involve Sandra in dis." Leon's eyes flickered to her, amused. "Yuh must be Miss Tiny. Yuh always think yuh can protect the whole village, eh?" He chuckled darkly. "But dis bigger than your shop. Yuh in over your head." Miss Tiny clenched her jaw, but before she could respond, Rasta John stepped forward. "Leon, dis no have to go dis way," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Me can fix it." Leon's smirk faded as he eyed Rasta John. "Yuh think yuh can fix dis, John? After all de mess Johnny create?" Rasta John nodded. "Me have connections. Me can get you de money. But yuh haffy leave Sandra out." Leon paused, considering. The room was heavy with tension as everyone waited for his response. Finally, Leon gave a slow, menacing smile. "All right, John," he said. You have 48 hours, but if you fail, his eyes shifted back to Johnny. Johnny dead, and Sandra too. Without another word, Leon and his men turned and left the shed, their footsteps disappearing into the night. Miss Tiny collapsed against the wall, her heart pounding in her chest. "What now, John?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rasta John looked out the door, his face unreadable. "Me gwan need to call in some favors," he muttered, "but me need you both to lay low. We no have much time." Johnny nodded, fear still gripping him. "Whatever you need, John. Just save Sandra." Miss Tiny, though exhausted and overwhelmed, stood tall. "We can't just wait for Leon to come back," she said. "We need to be ready." Rasta John glanced at her, his eyes dark with determination. "You right, Tiny. We gwan make sure Leon never touch Sandra, not while we still breathing." As they began to plan their next move, a rustling noise came from the bushes outside the shed. Rasta John tensed, peering into the darkness. Slowly, a figure emerged, a woman, her face hidden by a shawl. She stepped into the moonlight, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "Sandra?" Miss Tiny whispered, her heart stopping. The woman nodded, her voice trembling. "Me need your help. Me in trouble."